Thank you, everybody. Welcome to our first try of a Tuesday evening program for Sugarloaf on this nice chilly October evening. I'm Molly Thompson. I'm the director of Sugarloaf, the North Shore Stewardship Association, and I recognize many names out there. And I don't know if we're just seeing Margaret right now, or is everybody seeing myself? Or
I'm seeing you.
Okay, good. Okay. Well, anyway, I just want to remind everybody, Sugarloaf's a nonprofit, and we rely on donations, your memberships, and some grants, and our parking lot fees to fund all of our work that we do. And if you know our mission, it's to restore and protect the North Shore and Sugarloaf Cove, and to educate people about the North Shore. So if you aren't a member already, which I recognize a lot of those names out there, I hope that you will become a member. You can do that on our website, sugarloafnorthshore.org, or you can just call me at the office, 218-525-0001. Otherwise, and if you are a member, thank you for your support. So let's see, on to our program. Tonight, as you could have seen when you came on, our speaker is going to talk about bats. And our speaker is Russ Benedict. I'm going to read this. He's a professor of biology at Central College in Pella, Iowa. He began watching birds at the age of 11 and was introduced to the world of bats during graduate school in Nebraska. In the nearly 3 decades since, he has captured thousands of bats in the Midwest, the East Coast, and in Central America. He teaches classes in mammalogy, ornithology, tropical ecology, and conservation biology, and conducts research on bats and on prairie restoration. That all sounds pretty darn fun to me. So you probably saw the email about how did we find him? Well, he lost his phone at Sugarloaf Cove this summer. Marty found it, and we mailed it back to Russ, and he graciously became a member and offered to do a program for us. It's like, perfect. That's on bats. That sounds great. So that's how we found Russ. I'm glad he found us or left his phone at Sugarloaf. Although I'm wondering how you survived without a phone for all that time. Otherwise, just a couple things before we get started. A lot of you, I'm sure, have been on Zoom meetings for quite a few months now. But for this meeting, keep yourself muted. I'll be muting myself here. We want to have everybody muted, so if you have a dog barking in the background or something happening, we won't have all that in the background. If you don't mute yourself, then I may mute you because I have control here. And like Barb Lukanen was mentioning, you may want to turn off your video while Russ is talking because that'll help save your bandwidth. And we won't be able to see you anyway. So later on, when we have questions, let's turn on video and we can all chat with each other. That'll be just fine. And otherwise, I think that's just about it. So unless anybody has some question about Zoom out there, we can have Russ take it away.
All right, great. So can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. So again, my name is Russ Benedict, and I'm a biology professor. I have been working here at Central College for, I think this is my 19th year now. So Central College is in Pella, Iowa. So if you have Pella windows or know of them, that's the hometown. We're the hometown of Pella. But we're, I don't know, South Central Iowa, so a little bit outside of Des Moines, about 45 minutes away. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of my passions in life, and that is bats. The story for me with bats, I started off as kind of a bird watcher. I became introduced to birds by my 6th grade teacher, and that really opened the door to all aspects of nature for me. So I really am a real naturalist, I guess is the phrase. So I just am fascinated with everything. But I took a class, and it was during my master's degree, so I was in graduate school, and there was an assignment one night, and we had to go out with the professor and catch bats. And I remember at the time not wanting to do that. I had something important to do that night, probably watching football on TV or something like that. But I didn't want to go, but I did because I was a good student. And within about that next 3 hours, I knew that was something I was going to do for the rest of my life. If you get the chance to get out in nature and meet bats up close out in their world, they're just incredibly charismatic and they grab you. And so I'm just going to warn you a little bit, who knows where this talk is going to lead tonight. But I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and fire up the talk here. And this might just take me a second or two, or maybe not. Maybe it's just going to go perfectly right from the start. Okay, so again, there we go. There's our title, Exploring Bats in the Midwest. And so I'm in the state just to your south, but as it turns out, 8 out of the 9 bats that live in Iowa also live in Minnesota. And so this talk, in honesty, I've given a couple of times around the state of Iowa, and all I did was just to take out the word Iowa and put in, upper Midwest or something along those lines, because the bat community is really very similar. And by and large, what they're doing in Iowa is really not vastly different from what they're doing in Minnesota. So I have not yet caught bats in Minnesota, but I think that will be coming up here pretty quick. But nonetheless, basically the biology of what they're doing here in Iowa just translates perfectly to up north. So this is, I love this photograph. This is a little Indiana bat that I caught a bunch of years ago. And some bats are very mild-mannered, and so Indiana bats are one of those. And so this is an Indiana bat sitting on my hand. I've just put a wing band on her, and so you'd think she might be irritated at me for putting a wing band on, but she's just kind of sitting there staring at me. Many people think that bats are ugly, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on, but an awful lot of bats, if you can get them to shut their mouths, they're actually very pretty and very cute. And so I think this Indiana bat shows that pretty nicely. But one of their strategies when they're afraid is to open up their mouth and try and scare you away. So that's why you always see pictures of them with their mouths wide open. Okay, now what we're going to do, hold on here a second, for whatever reason, there we go. I like to do this in kind of quiz form. Now, it's hard to do quizzes over Zoom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask a quick question, and then I want you just to think of the answer in your head. Then I'm just going to give it to you. So ordinarily, if we were in person, I'd be constantly asking you questions, and I'd be teasing you if you weren't answering. But it's harder to do that in this setting. So I'll just go ahead and give you the answers. But the first question I have for you relates to that statement.
Hey,
Russ, yes.
I'm seeing your next screen also, so okay. I don't know if it's.
Hold on.
I don't want to, give away the.
Right. Okay. Hold on. I'm going to unshare. In fact, right now it's acting funky. It's not letting me do anything.
We had to have something. It worked perfect, everyone, just before we got on. So.
Yeah, that's right. Here, let's do this.
If you tell PowerPoint to go into presentation mode, it'll go full screen for you.
Yeah, well, I thought I was doing that, but let's try it.
It was great earlier.
Molly, are you recording?
I am.
Okay.
Let's try.
Thank you. Sorry, Ross, I didn't mean to ruin your talk.
No. Actually, that irritates me because my computer does that.
Mm-hmm.
I try to stop it from doing that. There we go. Now, okay, so hold on one second. And if I go that, boom. Now that's what we want. Is that right?
There we go. Thank you. Okay. Yes.
Perfect.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Thank you very much for correcting that. Okay, so now here we go. Yeah, because if you'd got to see it the way you were seeing it, then you'd know all the answers before I even asked the questions. Okay, so our first question then. So bats are the only mammals that are capable of true flight. And true flight means you flap your wings, and because you flap your wings, you can ascend. There's quite a few gliding mammals. They don't flap their wings, they simply glide. But if you're gliding, you only descend. Okay, so by flapping your wings, you're able to ascend. So what I want to know is, and here's the question for you, what other groups of animals are capable of true flight? Okay, so you're pondering that question. What other groups of animals are capable of true flight? A couple of them are really obvious, birds, insects, but there's a fourth one. And by the way, when I asked the question, I didn't specify that these have to be living mammals or living animals. So the pterosaurs, the pterodactyls, the flying dinosaurs, they were capable, apparently, based on the way their skeleton is designed, they were apparently capable of true flight. Okay, here's your next question. Whoops, I just blew it. I didn't necessarily say I'm hitting the buttons wrong. So my question for you was going to be, how many different kinds of bats are there? But there's your answer. So if we look around the world, we've got about 1,200 species of bats. And that's a big group. I mean, there's really not that many mammals. Mammals are a relatively small group on Earth. There's about 5,500 species of mammals. So about 20% of those are bats. So that makes this one of the biggest groups of all the mammals. Now, if you were paying attention a few seconds ago, you would already know the answer to this question, but how many different species of bats are found in Minnesota? And the answer to that is basically, depending upon which state you live in specifically. So in Iowa, we have 9, and in Minnesota, you've got 8. Now down here in Iowa, we have another 2 species that just kind of pop into the state on a time-to-time basis. They basically breed down to our south. But once their breeding colonies are done for the year, they break up and the individuals just wander. And these particular bats are long distance flyers. And so they can cover a couple of 100 miles in a night. So they just tend to wander all over the place. If you have been to Carlsbad Caverns down in New Mexico, the Brazilian free-tailed bat or the Mexican free-tailed bat, you'll hear either name for it, is one of these long distance flyers. And so they show up pretty regularly in late summer here in Iowa. And I'm going to bet they're probably up there in Minnesota as well. Okay, here is your next question. Of the mammals that are still alive, who are the closest relatives of bats? And I'll give you a little tiny bit of a hint, and that is people often refer to bats as blank with wings. Okay, so do you know the answer? Well, maybe you don't, because I kind of lied to you. So this is the thing I like to tell my students. I lie to them occasionally to try and get them to work on their critical thinking skills. And so that was me lying to you. So people often call bats mice with wings or rats with wings. But in fact, bats are not at all really that closely related to mice or to rats. They're mammals, so from that standpoint, they're related. But as it turns out, the closest living relatives to bats are shrews. Shrews, apparently, that combination of shrews and bats is apparently more closely related to primates than they are actually to rodents. So if you want to call bats a little flying human, that's actually more accurate than calling them mice with wings. But shrews, which are in fact quite common all throughout the upper Midwest, are the closest living relatives of bats. Okay, now here is your next set of quiz questions. So as a rule, bats are very small critters. So the average size for a bat is like, I don't know, 1.5 car keys. And so it actually works out to be like 20 grams or so, but 20 grams doesn't really mean an awful lot to people, but 20 grams is roughly 1.5 car keys. This is kind of the old fashioned metal car keys, not the ones with the big fobs on them. But despite that small size, they actually have very big impacts on ecosystems. Actually, let me do a quick little side. I'm going to get what's what I'm looking for here. I'm getting sidetracked a little bit. The smallest bat on Earth weighs much less than a penny, but we actually have bats here in the upper Midwest that weigh about the weight of a penny. So some bats are very small. The biggest bat on Earth has a wingspan of about 6 feet, between 5 and 6 feet, but even that bat only weighs in at about 2 pounds. So bats are small mammals. But here is now my question for you, and that is, there are 3 main things that bats do that make them seriously important in terms of ecosystems. So can you name those 3? And I'll just give them to you one at a time. The one is the most obvious, the one that we understand the best here in the upper Midwest, and that is a major predator of insects. So in fact, many thoughts are that they are the primary predator of night-flying insects. And we'll talk a tiny bit more about that here in a little while. Okay, now the other 2 huge impacts that they have are primarily tropical impacts. And so if you head down to the tropics, there are many plants that are pollinated primarily or exclusively by bats. Nobody knows that exact number, because literally knowing who it is that pollinates a particular species of plant requires that you know a lot about that plant. And you get down to the tropics and there's an awful lot of plants that we don't know much about. But the guess is that down in the tropics, we're probably talking about 15, maybe as much as 25% of all plants are being pollinated primarily by bats, or in some cases exclusively by bats. And then the third role that they play is, again, a tropical thing, and that is that they are really important seed dispersers. So there are quite a few bats that eat fruits, and the fruit eaters, the seeds, they either regurgitate them and spit them back out, or they go all the way through and come out the other end. But research in Africa has shown that when you have a clear-cut forest here, and it's sitting right next to an existing rainforest, about 80% of the rain of seeds out into that clear-cut area, and therefore about 80% of the seedlings that come up are trees that are being dispersed by bats. So it's really important as seed dispersers. So that combination really makes this literally one of the most important groups of mammals there are out there. Okay, now this is a picture of a pallid bat, P-A-L-L-I-D, and pallid bats are pretty common down in the desert southwest of the U.S. But I just love this picture with him backlit with the sun coming through the wings, because you can really get such a beautiful look at their anatomy. So this is just a quick glance at the anatomy of a bat. So first of all, if you can picture, this may or may not mean anything to you, but if you can picture Arnold Schwarzenegger. Arnold Schwarzenegger, back before he was governor of California, he was a bodybuilder. And if you ever saw any pictures of him as a bodybuilder, this is what he looked like. He had this enormous upper body and then these little tiny hips. So bats basically are bodybuilders is what they are. 30, 35, sometimes 40% of their body weight is in the enormous muscles of the chest and the great big muscles of the back, the muscles that are powering those wings. So huge upper body, but then tiny little muscles down associated with the back legs and the hips. So bats, most bats at least, are not very good at walking. They can do it, but they're not fast and they're not very efficient at it. But they've just completely dedicated the majority of that muscle up there to their wings. But now take a look at wing design. So the wings are simply their forelimbs. And all they've really done, birds, the design of a bird's skeleton inside its wing is quite modified. It's actually kind of hard to recognize which bone is which in some cases, because they've gotten rid of some bones, they've fused other bones together. Bats really haven't done that much. All they've done is elongate the bones, okay? So first of all, this bone right here is the humerus, okay? So the humerus is your upper arm, and their humerus, so it starts somewhere in here. A lot of this that you're seeing here is muscle associated with the upper parts of the humerus. So it starts somewhere in there and comes out to about there. So this is the elbow joint right there. Their humerus is about similar in size in relation to their body as your humerus is. But now look at their forearm. So these bones right here, that's the radius and the ulna, okay? And so their radius and ulna is about double the length of the humerus. So compare that on you, and what we see is our humerus and our forearm are roughly the same dimensions. So they have lengthened the forearm, the radius, and the ulna. But that's just the start of the lengthening. This right here, this little mass is the hand. There's the thumb sticking up. So the thumb actually sticks up free of the wing and has a claw on it. And they can actually climb with that. If you ever watch one climb up something, it's pretty amazing to watch. They can grip things with that thumb. The index finger and the middle finger run right along the front edge of the wing. There's the ring finger, and here's the pinky. Now look at the dimensions of the pinky. The pinky itself is a little bit longer than the radius and the ulna is. So their pinky is literally longer than their forearm is. And the longest finger in their body, the middle finger, starts right here, and you wouldn't really be able to see it all that well. Just like I'm going to move some of my pictures here, but it ends here off the screen. So almost to the edge of the black is where the middle, right where the blue and the black meet, is right about where the middle finger would end. So the middle finger is almost 2 times the length of the forearm. So they've dramatically increased the length of the fingers. They've increased the length of the forearm, and then they've wrapped this thin sheet of skin around everything. Then the thin sheet of skin comes down here. It encloses the hind legs and then wraps across to the tail. So you basically get this kite kind of a design. So they really have very large wings for their body size. Now, a couple other quick notes about this. Oh, and by the way, I think what we'll do, so it's kind of up to you. If you want to ask questions as we're going along, I think what Molly had suggested is text or chat the messages to Molly, and she can interrupt and ask the questions But I also intend to leave, 15 minutes or so at the very end. And I've actually got tons of time tonight. So if we can ask questions at the end too, it doesn't really matter to me how you want to do that. But notice these parallel ribbons right in here. Those are little strips of muscle. So they can control the shape of the right wing and hold it in a slightly different position than they hold the left wing. We'll talk more about that in a second. Then you also notice blood vessels running around out in there. So this is skin, really not vastly different from the skin that you have. I've had little kids, I do lots of programs where we go out in summer and try and catch bats. And I've had little kids who've touched their wing, and they've told me that it feels kind of like bubble gum when you blow a bubble. And I think that's a pretty good description. It's tougher than that, but it does feel quite a bit like that. You will notice that they get holes in their wings. This guy has a hole there, and I think there's probably a little hole right there. But you'll also notice scars, and so they'll heal those holes up pretty quickly. So here's a scar over here on this side. That's another scar there. So this guy has had several holes in the past, but has healed them up. Okay, now 2 last things from this picture. So this flap of skin that goes from one back foot to the other and encloses the tail, that's called the tail membrane. And they use the tail membrane as a rudder to help them steer in flight. But they also, as it turns out, can steer simply by holding the right wing in a different position than the left wing. So if the right wing is more cupped than the left wing is, that's going to cause you to turn also. So they don't necessarily have to have the tail membrane to steer. But the other thing they can do with their tail membrane is they can roll it up kind of like a window blind rolls up. And so they can trap insects in there. So quite a few of the insects that they catch, they will scoop up with their tail and then kind of wrap the tail up, or they'll even knock them down and knock them into the tail membrane using their wings. So I refer to their tail membrane kind of as their baseball glove. Okay, so that's the overall design of bats and wings. Most of the body is really just standard mammal body, really not vastly different from what you have, just crammed into a super tiny little package. Okay, now this next picture is basically what it says there. It's variations on a theme. And so I like this because we now see a couple of different designs of bat anatomy. So we'll start with this guy right here. This is one of the Glossophaga. There's a bunch of the tropical bats, especially, that don't really have much in the way of common names. So we just call them by their scientific names. This is Glossophaga. There's a bunch of different species of Glossophaga, and they're really hard to tell apart from each other. You either have to take blood samples and do genetic work on them, or you have to kill them and look at the specific dimensions of their skull. So normally when I take students down to the tropics, over every other winter break, we head down to the tropics, and I don't kill a whole bunch of Glossophaga just to figure out which one it is. But you'll notice something interesting about our Glossophaga here. He has no tail membrane. So what does it mean if he has no tail membrane? Well, if you recall, you don't have to have a tail membrane to steer. You can use the wings to steer. So that's how he's steering. And the other thing that the lack of a tail membrane is kind of giving you hints for is he doesn't eat insects. He's not scooping insects up with his tail membrane. If you look at the snout, that's a hint. And if you look at the tongue, that's more of a hint. The tongue is so long in this bat that he can't actually pull it all the way back into its mouth. It pretty much permanently has that little tip sticking out. This is a nectar and a pollen feeder. So he hovers in front of flowers, puts his long snout down into the flower, and then inserts his even longer tongue down into the flower to get to the nectar down below. Very commonly when we catch Glossophaga, their face and their shoulders are all covered with yellow pollen, or sometimes it's whitish pollen. Okay, so there's one design, giving you a sense that, yeah, bats actually tinker quite a bit with their designs. Now, these 2 pictures here are largely designed to show you just wing dimensions. This guy in the upper right is a Townsend's big-eared bat. So this guy is from down in southeastern or southwestern deserts. And you'll notice he's got very short wings, but they're very broad. Okay, this guy, this is actually the Brazilian or Mexican free-tailed bat, the one that lives in Carlsbad Caverns. And it has very long wings, and they're very slender, and they come to a pretty sharp point. This is the same thing that you will see in birds. If you look at a chickadee has really more of this design with short, round wings. Short, round wings are built for maneuverability. They're not super fast. They're not super efficient, but they're very good at maneuverability. This guy actually flies in and among the tree branches, and he is echolocating for caterpillars, caterpillars walking on twigs, caterpillars chewing on leaves. When he finds one, he hovers in front of it and then pulls it off there. You have to have incredible mobility and maneuverability to move in and among tight tree branches and hover in front of a caterpillar. The Mexican free-tailed bat, on the other hand, is a long-distance flyer. They'll cover 100 to 300 miles in a night. They're way up high. They're 1,000 feet up, and they're looking for these clouds of migrating insects. Once they find them, they just kind of fly back and forth in loops, just kind of moving in and out of that cloud to get insects. But you really need to have efficiency. And so that's what long, narrow wings, think seagull. That's what the long, narrow wings are for, is very efficient flight. They're not super maneuverable. They aren't always the fastest, but they are very efficient. So that's just showing you designs. One of the fun things to think about with these guys is free-tailed bats are really easy to catch in mist nets. If you guys have done one of the mist netting programs there at Sugarloaf, we use the same kinds of nets for bats. These guys are pretty easy because they're so non-maneuverable that even though they may detect the nets, by the time they detect them, it's normally too late. They can't get out of the way and we still catch them. This guy, on the other hand, just flies very slowly right up to the net, hovers in front of the net, then turns around and flies away. And they're actually really hard to catch. Okay, now here's a couple of my favorite pictures. And this all relates to something that bat biologists hear a lot. And that is people say, yeah, but they're so ugly. But most things in biology, if you understand why they're ugly, they become beautiful. And so I think that applies to bats too. So this is actually that same picture we just looked at. Well, not literally the same picture, but the same bat. This is another one of the big-eared bats. So again, this is a bat that is got phenomenal echolocation because it can move in and around tree branches, echolocating the whole time. But it also has the ability to hear caterpillars chewing. And so you have to have pretty sensitive hearing to hear a caterpillar chew. But that's what the incredible ears are all about. Okay, now this next picture, I'm not going to show you the next picture quite yet. When I go down to the tropics, I always have to take another faculty member with me. In the early years, twice I brought my wife with me. And my wife is very good at getting bats out of mist nets, which, again, if you've ever watched bird banding, is quite a challenge. But she's very good at that. And so there was one night we were in Costa Rica, and I was getting one bat out, and she was probably, I don't know, 50 feet away from me taking another bat out. And she kind of yelled at me and said, I've never seen this kind of bat before. So I said, well, describe it. So she gave me a little bit of a description. And from the description, I was starting to get pretty excited because I was thinking maybe this is the bat I've always wanted to see. And then she said something that will just has stuck in my head to this day. And she said, I think he's been in some sort of a horrible accident. And when she said that, I knew who it was. It was the bat I'd always wanted to see. So there is the wrinkle-faced bat. And yeah, I mean, is that ugly? I suppose so. But this is a fruit eater. Most fruit eaters eat pretty small fruits. So they'll fly up to the plant, they'll hover in front of the fruit, they'll sniff it to see if it's ripe. Then they'll grab it they've got great big canine teeth, they'll grab it, they'll pop it off, and they'll take it somewhere else to eat it. This guy instead eats large fruits, and he kind of hugs them. So he lands on the fruit. This is a small bat again, and kind of wraps his wings around and just starts chewing. A good chunk of the calories that this bat gets actually comes from fruit juice. So he's really a fruit juice feeder. A researcher then kind of used that and said, well, I wonder if that's what all the face wrinkles are all about. So he put droplets of colored fluid on the face of this bat. No matter where he put the drops of colored fluid, the drops flowed right to the bat's mouth, and then the bat had a long tongue and would lick them up. So the naked face then is, if you're drinking fruit juice, you don't want to have a hairy face because then the fruit juice is just going to get stuck in all that hair and you're not going to be able to get to a lot of it. On top of that, it's going to attract bacteria or fungi, which could be a bad thing. So you have a naked face and then all these cool little wrinkles that direct the fruit juice away from the eyes, away from the mouth, and away from the nose and right down to the mouth. So again, if you understand why some of these things in nature are ugly, then they're not ugly anymore. Okay, now I'm going to zip through a couple of slides here real fast. This is just to give you a little bit of a sense for how we catch bats. So we set up mist nets. Here you can see a big brown bat stuck in a mist net. There's the pole system we use. I have small poles that I use, which are only like 8 feet high. This system is about 35 feet high. And this is the kind of a place where we usually catch bats. So we look for either streams that run through woods or roads that run through woods, because bats like to barrel up and down those flight paths. Then what we do is we look for places where the trees arch out over that flight path. That forces the bats down low, and we put our nets underneath there. The more clutter from tree branches, the better, because that helps to hide our nets. Okay, they're not super efficient. The guess is we probably only catch 1 out of every 10 bats or so that flies by, but it is at the moment the most efficient method we actually have of catching bats. Okay, now here's just, these are all pictures of Iowa bats, but almost all of these guys, other than this one right here, are also Minnesota bats. So what I'm going to do is show you just a couple of pictures of Minnesota bats, kind of targeting bats with particular traits that I wanted to highlight. Okay, so first of all, big brown bat. So if you have seen a bat in a house or in a church or in a building, it's a pretty good chance it's a big brown bat. Now, people often confuse them with little brown bats because, as it turns out, big brown bats aren't all that big. Compared to little brown bats, they're very big, but still, bats are just such a small group that people always expect something with the name of big brown bat to be, you know, the size of a bison or something like that. But these guys have a wingspan of about, 10 inches wide or so. A big female will have a wingspan of about 12 inches wide. But this is one of the most common bats that will use buildings and other kinds of human structures. This is essentially the robin of the bat world. So big brown bats live in all conceivable habitats. Their numbers are probably doing better than they ever have in the past. They've figured out how to live with people, and lots of animals that have figured out how to live with people, their numbers are doing very well. But this probably also is about $1 billion bat or so. They eat so many agricultural pests that they are a super important critter. Okay, here is the little brown bat, and little brown bats' body weight size are about half the size of big brown bats. This, up until very recently, was one of the most abundant bats across the northern US and the eastern US. And so these guys probably occur all the way across Minnesota. But it's also one of the bats that is declining really fast. There's a number of bats that are declining because of white nose syndrome, which I'll tell you a little tiny bit about here in a few minutes. And little browns are one of those. From what I'm hearing, the rumbles I'm hearing from the folks that I work with at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I think this guy is being evaluated to be put on the endangered species list, because it is declining in some places 95% or even higher than that in some states because of this fungus. Okay, here's a bat that I do a lot of work with. So this is the one that is found in Iowa that is not found in Minnesota. This is the Indiana bat. It is already a federally endangered species. And one of the interesting things that they do is, and it kind of highlights the importance of standing dead trees. These guys roost in standing dead trees. They like standing dead trees that still have the bark in place. So they get up underneath that peeling bark. There's actually about 3 or 4 different species of bats around here that roost in that same place. And there's all sorts of other critters that use standing dead trees. So I always encourage landowners to try and hold on to those standing dead trees as long as you possibly can, unless they're in a place where they really create a danger. These guys migrate away from Iowa. They're only really found in about the southern half of Iowa anyways, and then they migrate down and they hibernate in caves mostly down in Missouri. And so this is a guy I've done a lot of work with. I mentioned that already. So here's on the left, we've got a female that I've put a wing band on, and I've also put a radio collar on her. And so we just use a little bit of surgical glue, and we glue the radio tag right there between your shoulder blades. By about day 3 to day 10, somewhere in there, the bats will actually kind of rub up against the bark and just knock the tag off. And so it doesn't do any long-term damage to them. And it has to weigh less than 5% of the body weight of the bat. So we aren't really impacting them by putting them on the bats. But we're trying to figure out specifically what kinds of habitats are they roosting in, specifically what kinds of trees are they roosting in, et cetera, et cetera. And then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service folks go into the caves where they hibernate in winter and do surveys for them. And so very commonly at the end of each winter, I'll get an email from U.S. Fish and Wildlife folks asking me, okay, where did you catch bat 111? Because we just found her roosting in a cave down in central Missouri. And by the way, as it turns out, what we get primarily in Iowa in terms of Indiana bats are females. So when I say she on these guys, I often literally do mean she, because oftentimes those are the primary ones we catch. And they're essentially the only ones that we put radio tags on. Another guy I've done a lot of work on, this is the northern long-eared bat. This is another one that used to be very common in Minnesota. Another one that is really tanking because of that fungus. In a typical summer 5 years ago, I would have caught 40 to 50 northern long-eared bats over the course of the summer. And I have only caught one in the last 2 years. So they're really crashing. And they're just a beautiful, mild-mannered little bat. They're mostly insect eaters, but they'll also hover in front of spider webs and pull spiders out of their webs. Then just real fast here, this is one of the bats that you'll see pretty commonly where you actually can tell what they are. They'll come out early at night so that you can see that they're definitely orange. So this is the eastern red bat. This is another really common bat in across much of Minnesota and very common across Iowa as well. They roost out in the leaves of trees, and because of that, they face more cold weather than many other bats do that are roosting more like in woodpecker holes or hollow trees, those kinds of places where they have some protection. So you'll notice they have hair extending way out under their wings. They have really dense, long hair. They have short-ish ears that they can kind of fold down into the hair. So they really are well designed for the cold. And then this is the biggest bat that we have here in the Midwest. This is the hoary bat. And notice that's spelled like hoar frost, not like WHOR. This is a long distance migrant. So this guy will breed across much of the upper Midwest and then spends the winter down on islands in the Caribbean and even down into Central America. So this is a long distance migrant. A big female in this will have a wingspan of about 18 inches or so. So that's a good sized bat. And by the way, in the bat world, females tend to be about 10% larger than males. And both eastern red bats and hoary bats are declining, and we think that's because of wind farms. If you want, we can go into that to the end. I have a slide about it, but I'm just going to kind of skip by it because there's a particular topic I want to make sure to get to. Okay, so let's talk for a couple of these kind of additional side issues that are very important. So first, let's talk a little bit about white-nose fungus. So white-nose fungus is a European fungus that was accidentally brought here by cavers. It was first discovered in the US in 2006 in upstate New York in a cave, and since then has been spreading out. I'll show you essentially the latest map that has come out. It impacts bats when they're hibernating. And so you can see this is a little tricolored bat that I took a picture of here in Iowa. He's got white nose, the white fungus on the nose, and there's also some here on the wings as well. And what it does is it basically irritates them. It apparently itches their skin so that they wake up many times during hibernation. And if you wake up too many times during hibernation, you burn all your fuel and you don't make it until spring. So the biggest impacts here in the upper Midwest is on little brown bats, northern long-eared bats, and this guy, what's called a tricolored bat.
Hey,
Okay.
Russ?
Yes.
Oh, you may be about to answer this. We had a question. Why do some species of bats get white nose disease and others don't?
Okay. So there you go. Great question. Get to work on that. That is a great PhD question because nobody really knows the answer to that yet. It is very clear that most of the members, I don't know how well you know scientific names, but bats, the first part of their scientific name is called the genus. Most bats in the genus Myotis are pretty sensitive to it. So little brown bats and northern long-eared bats and Indiana bats are all in the genus Myotis. That tells us they're closely related. They all get hammered by it. But then there's a number of other bats that aren't in that same genus that in fact aren't even all that closely related, and they also get hammered by it. So we really don't know why some bats are negatively impacted to the extent they are, and other ones don't really appear to be impacted at all. Okay. So what we see in some of these caves is just sky-high mortality rates in those species that are affected. So sometimes 100% mortality rates. So here you can just see this terrible pile of dead bats here. And other times just only 90%. So incredibly high mortality rates. At least 7 million bats killed so far, probably well more than that. That's just the estimates based on the ones that we can find. Since these are such critically important bats, how are ecosystems going to be impacted? especially little brown bats, which were used to be literally one of the most common mammals in North America, and now they're down by 95%. So what is that going to do to ecosystems? And the next question is, are there going to be extinctions? And it's possible. Some of the bats that are being hammered by this are bats that are already on the endangered species list anyway. So it's conceivable we could see some extinctions. So there is the map from last winter. So that since this is kind of a winter explosion thing, we really only get the map updated towards the end of the winter. So somewhere in March or April or so, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service folks will re-update this. The red X is where it was first discovered, and then the different colors show you different years. Okay, and so yellows are, what we saw out here across much of the Midwest. And so yellows are what, 2015, 2017, somewhere in that range. But you'll notice then in just the last couple of years, we've now got reds out here. So it's just, the fungus is just marching its way across the United States. This out here in the West, we don't know what happened there. And same with this population up here. These were little brown bats. Little brown bats do move long ways. So it may have been a little brown bat that flew that far. But the guess is that it may have been a little brown bat that stowed away in shipping containers in a semi that got transported there or something like that. That's the leading guess as to how it got way out west like that. Okay, we're going to skip the wind turbine stuff just in the interest of time. But if you have questions about it, you can certainly ask me. But the thing I wanted to kind of finish up with here is a little bit on bats and COVID-19. This is something that was in the news a while back, but it really hasn't been in the news much lately. And that is that bats play a role in COVID-19, but it really shines the light on bigger environmental problems. So the virus that causes COVID-19, you already know this, it's a coronavirus. But the coronaviruses, that's a big family of viruses. There are thousands, probably tens of thousands of species of coronaviruses, very common in mammals and birds all around the world. And they some of them cause the common cold, but most of them really literally do nothing to species other than the species that they're sometimes in. If we look exactly at the DNA of the specific virus that causes COVID-19, researchers did this very fast. As soon as the virus exploded there, the first case was December 2019, and then exploded pretty quickly after that. So there's been just a flurry of research activity. And so researchers have looked at the genetic sequence of the virus that is causing COVID-19 and comparing that to all other known viruses. And what they found is that the closest match is about a 96% match. It's a very high match with horseshoe bats, which are very common bats across a good chunk of Europe and into Asia. But in particular, one species of horseshoe bat that lives right in the area of Wuhan, China, where this all started, that's what it appears that coronavirus came from. But you'll notice I only said it's a 96% match. There's 4% of the genetic sequence is different between the virus in humans versus the virus in bats. 4% of the genetic sequence roughly equates to about 40 years of evolutionary time in the virus world. So for the last 40 years, this virus has been floating around somewhere else. It hasn't been in this horseshoe bat, it's been in somebody else. But that actually is pretty common. There's been other diseases that we've been watching here lately that are caused by viruses that are carried by bats. And in most of those cases, another mammal is involved, what we often refer to as a bridge animal. And that animal is the one that harbors the virus for a little while and then allows the virus to jump to humans. So in some of these other diseases, it was camels in one case. It was these little weird kind of mongoose relatives called civets in another case. We don't actually know what the bridge animal is for COVID-19. One of the guesses based on some data is maybe it's a pangolin. So that's that weird little guy there in the lower right-hand corner. But it's pretty clear that there was a bridge animal, something that kind of took the virus, went from the bats to this animal and then into humans. And it took about 40 years roughly to make that jump. But based on what we've seen in other diseases, the bridge animal is probably something that we interact with on a regular basis. So it's probably some sort of a mammal that we use for food or for farming in some other way, okay? And so that's starting to give us some hints now that are going beyond just being interesting and now really starting to give us some hints as to how diseases may be arising and how maybe we can battle them in the future. So a couple of quick notes here on bats. Bats do carry lots of viruses. We don't entirely know why that is. There's a couple of guesses as to why they may, and I listed some of those there. But of all the mammals on Earth, bats carry a lot of viruses. And in particular, they carry a lot of coronaviruses. So researchers have actually known this for a couple of decades. They've looked at bats all around the world and seen literally thousands of species of coronaviruses in bats everywhere, including bats here in the US. Now, by and large, those coronaviruses are harmless. Occasionally they'll spill over to humans, but normally it's just some sort of a mild disease. But that has been changing here in about the last 2 decades. So in the last 2 decades, we've had 2 coronaviruses jump from bats into humans. So first was SARS, which everybody, most people have heard of in 2002. And then a little bit later on was MERS. And MERS is what, Mid-East or Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, I think is what MERS stands for. And SARS is what, Southeast Asian respiratory syndrome. But MERS was much more localized, but was actually had a higher fatality rate than SARS did. So that brings us to a good question. So if bats have carried coronaviruses for so long, why all of a sudden are we seeing these viruses that are jumping from bats to other species and then to us? So this is where the story gets really interesting. In 2018, so about 16 months before the first coronavirus patient was ever recognized in Wuhan, China, 16 months before, researchers published a paper and they nailed it. They exactly predicted this. They said a pandemic is going to happen and it's either going to be in Southeastern Asia or adjacent China. It's going to involve a coronavirus and it's going to come from bats. So researchers literally predicted the coronavirus outbreak that we're seeing right now. So what was it that they used to predict that? Well, they were looking at places around the world where there are lots of bats, which are known to carry coronaviruses, where there are high rates of deforestation, where there's a rapidly growing human population, and where the people tend to use bats for food or for medicine or for something along those lines. So they just made maps around the world and said, here are the places where there are lots of bats, lots of deforestation, lots of use of animals as a food source. And they had a couple of these red blobs show up on maps and they said, here's the places where it's going to happen. So what that also unfortunately means is we think it's going to happen again because there were other places that they targeted where they thought this might happen. So what that means is that it isn't actually the bats themselves that are the cause of this, rather it's our interaction with the earth. So we think that what's happening here is that as human populations explode, as we increase deforestation, humans move out into the forests. And in this case, what that ends up meaning is that the bats were there in the forest, some of those actually persist and they start living in the houses right with us. Okay, so we're now living in much more intimate contact with the bats than we ever would have before. But that second point is also key. And that is, as we move out into these places, we're bringing livestock with us, we're bringing pets with us. And our livestock and our pets, they're now interacting with the wildlife that was out there in those rainforests. And they're also sharing viruses with each other. On top of that, you've got bats and other wildlife species that never really used to come together, but we're forcing them to come together because of deforestation. They're sharing viruses with each other. You're getting these weird new viruses that are evolving within them. So we literally think that this isn't a bat problem. This is a human interaction with the earth and with wildlife, and as a rule, that's leading to this increase in viruses being spread from wildlife to us. Okay, now last slide, and this is just to kind of keep things from being too much of a downer. I just wanted to kind of return to some pretty pictures of bats. And these are some of the bats that we catch when we head down to Costa Rica. So Costa Rica is where I visit with students, and just showing you a couple of great looking little bats. The guy down in the lower right, you often hear that phrase, blind as a bat. We don't actually think very many bats are blind. Bats probably have decent eyesight. But the guy down in the lower right, we actually think based on the microscopic structure of its eyes, it probably is actually blind. Its echolocation is just off the charts in terms of the kinds of details it can get. So it apparently has, as the eyesight has decreased, or more than likely the opposite, as the echolocation has increased in sophistication, the eyes have simply decreased. Then the other two guys both belong to a group of bats that are called the leaf-nosed bats. And I think you can see why. And that kind of leads to a good question, though, and that is, what the heck is the purpose of that big flap of skin sticking up off the nose? And I would be willing to bet that you may not get this one. This is kind of a tough one. When I show this to actual live crowds, yeah, basically nobody gets this. But this goes back to 5th grade. Take yourself back to 5th grade. You're sitting in the cafeteria at school. You're drinking out of that cardboard carton of milk. You take a big slam of milk and somebody next to you tells a joke. And you start laughing and the milk comes out your nose, right? Remember those days? There's a connection between our nose and our mouth, way at the back of our throat. These guys take advantage of that. These guys are what are referred to as nasal emitters. So they make the sound with their vocal cords, just like I am now, but instead of shooting the sound out through their mouth, the sound actually shoots out through their nose. That allows them to have a mouthful of food, but they're still able to carry out echolocation. That flap of skin lays forward as they're echolocating so that it essentially directs the sound straight out in front of them, like they're speaking through a bullhorn, as opposed to just having that sound go off in all directions. So that's what we think the nose leaf on a beautiful tropical bat is. This guy, by the way, down here is a fruit eater, but also feeds on pollen. So there you can see some of the pollen on his neck. And these guys are both primarily insect eaters. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to click to this slide for a minute. In case you're interested in some reading, these tend to be more scientific type readings, but many of them are readable. If you're interested in looking at some references related to bats and coronaviruses, I'll leave that up for a couple of seconds. Then I think I'll probably go back to that previous picture for questions, just because it's kind of a pretty picture to show when we're having questions. So with that, I think I'll go ahead and maybe have let Molly read off some of the other questions that may have been posted. And other than that, I don't really care. I'll leave this up to Molly if she wants to, if we just want to let people unmute themselves and ask questions, or do you prefer that they chat the questions to you?
I think they can unmute. I can start with 2 that we just got that were in the chat. Lowell was asking, if cavers brought white nose syndrome to New York, are cavers helping it migrate in North America?
Yes, but what we have seen is that across the US, a bunch of caves that were formerly open to cavers were closed, and they were closed very early. There was a cave that was closed in Iowa 5 years before the fungus ever got here. It remained closed and the fungus still got here. So yes, we do think that cavers are spreading the fungus, but we also know that bats are spreading the fungus. So to some extent, it may not matter now that it's here because it appears that the bats are also spreading it.
Okay. And Lowell also was asking, do northern Minnesota bats all migrate or do some hibernate? How can I tell if bats have left a particular place?
So I'd have to think about I'd have to think about the 8 specific that live there. You're roughly split in half. So about half the bats migrate way a ways, all the way out of the state, and in fact, several states away. The other half will hibernate. They'll either hibernate right there in your vicinity, or in some cases, they'll fly 50 miles away to a good cave system and hibernate there. But how can you tell that they're gone? It depends a little bit. The only places where they can hibernate are places that stay above freezing in winter. So if you have like a barn or a shed or something like that, they're not going to be in there during the winter. So they will be gone by now. But in your house, they may well be hibernating in your house. And so you really, unfortunately, wouldn't know.
And let's see, our next question from Helen is, how does the decline in insect populations affect bat survival?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I don't know how much you've been paying attention to this insect apocalypse. They're referring to it as, or the windshield effect. And the windshield effect doesn't mean that windshields are killing insects. It means that the insect populations have crashed so much that we don't need to clean our windshields as much as we used to anymore. So essentially, we're using the windshield as a way of censusing insect populations. But around the world, insect populations are crashing, and there's no doubt about that. And it's really pretty terrifying to think about the implications of that. But there's a high likelihood that we are seeing bat declines and bird declines because of the insect declines. But this is one of those deals. I mean, so much of biology is really poorly known, and so therefore we don't literally know that they're declining, but they almost have to be.
The next question's kind of to me, it's saying Sugarloaf has a couple of bat houses. Do we know if any bats have used them? And I don't know. I
Okay.
don't know if any volunteers there have seen it, so.
The-
And then let's see,
you can shine a light up in them and check, but the main
yeah,
way is just watch for poop accumulating down below. But if bat houses are not exposed to the sun, bats don't generally use them. They really want the bat houses to be hot. And
Okay.
it literally cannot get, well, I suppose if you lit them on fire, it could get too hot. But from the sun, it can't get too hot.
okay. Let's see, Dana would like you to return to the wind farm slide info.
Okay. I knew someone would want to.
Yeah, that'd be good.
There it is. Yeah, so there's a couple of species are really hammered by wind turbines. Every wind turbine that has been examined so far has had at least some mortality, but the mortality is not scattered evenly throughout the year. It's primarily during migration, late summer, and into fall. And there actually has been some research showing that we can modify the turbines to reduce mortality. Unfortunately, that does cut energy production a bit. It's not a huge energy production loss, but there is some loss. But there's still quite a bit of research going on into how we can modify the turbines to minimize impact. But yeah, at the moment, they're pretty significant impact.
Did you have another question about that, Dana? Or you? Let's see if he asked.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's a couple of fairly
Yeah.
recent papers out there about bats and wind turbines. So you can do a little bit of digging and find quite a bit of information on it.
Okay. We have Debbie saying this program is incredible. Thank you, Russell.
Well, great, thanks.
And let's see, Julie's asking, what do you say to folks who believe COVID-19 was manufactured in a lab in China?
I don't know, so often the people who kind of have, I don't know, so, this is political.
Yeah. Oh, you can
So often people that are entrenched in those ideas, you're not going to change their mind. So the goal really is to try and prevent them from spreading misinformation to other people, not as much literally trying to change their minds, because they're probably not going to listen to you anyways.
Here's Dana's kind of, I believe, follow-up question. He was wondering, the damage to the bats, is it pressure damage, like, in the ear?
Right.
area?
There was a little bit of research early on that was looking at, was it literally impacts of the blades, or is it, because right out in front of the blade is an area of very high wind pressure. And so one researcher had actually suggested that it's literally the wind pressure itself that's killing them, not the blades. But from what I understand, the wind pressure only extends out in front of the blades just a matter of a few inches. So I guess I've never really understood what the difference is. But then later work actually said, no, it probably is literally the blades that is hitting them. And what's interesting is the slower the blades move, the more likely they are to hit bats. Probably because at faster speeds, the bats can detect them, but at slower speeds, for whatever reason, they can't. That's the guess.
Opposite of birds. Opposite of birds.
Right.
Yep. Let's see. We have, do you catch bats during the day? I thought they were nocturnal, Margaret was asking.
No, we do catch them at night. Yeah. So during the summer, I become a night owl, which is not really my natural pattern. But we normally, when we're out netting, they'll be really active for about the first 2 to 3 hours after sunset. But then there's some activity pretty much all throughout the night.
Let's see. Excuse me. Beverly asked, is anyone researching the microbiome of the nose of healthy bats versus those with white nose syndrome? Bacterial antifungals might play a role.
Yes, there was, and I don't know, it actually hasn't been published yet, but I was sending tissue swabs, just using Q-tips and then putting them in little sterile containers from a bunch of different species of bats. So yes, somebody is looking at that. Right now I can't remember the name of the person, but that was just probably 3 years ago. So my guess is it hasn't been published yet. So yeah, somebody is looking at that.
Thank you. Okay, let's see. Lowell asks, when is a good season to install a bat house? What are the desired characteristics for northern Minnesota?
So bat houses are not hugely used. And so one of the things I always tell folks is don't go out and spend hundreds of dollars buying bat houses. In fact, my main advice is if you like to do woodwork, then just build your own. And they need to be, there's a number of different plans for them online. Probably the biggest characteristic is you want them high enough up in the air so that they're safe from raccoons and cats. But you also need to have them in the sun. So they need to be, I have a couple on my house. One's on a power pole and the other one's on just a post associated with my house. And they're both facing straight south. They're painted black so that they really get hot during the summer. And we have been lucky and we've got bats. The more, and of course, northern Minnesota doesn't have any of this, but if you're out in wooded areas, then you've got better success versus right in the middle of cities. And if you're closer to water, you've got better chances than if you're right in the middle of the city.
Okay, lots of bugs.
Yeah.
Let's see, anybody want to just ask a question without having to type it in? Feel free. And don't be
I will
shy.
ask
There we go.
something. So I can't figure out it. We have an unenclosed porch with a really high ceiling. And I find little bits of it, looks like, little turdies or something, little bits. It could be mice, I suppose, but I don't know why. I always think could be bats because it's very close to the wall. So, it could be like bats kind of clinging, but I've never seen any bats up there.
Okay. So two things. First of all, pick up one of the little turds, put it in
Yep.
your hand, rub it with your finger. Okay. Rub
Yep.
it like that. And what'll
Yep.
happen is if it's a mouse turd, it won't break. It'll be really hard and it won't break. But if it's a bat turd, it will just disintegrate. And then if you look at it, it's just little bits of insect exoskeleton. You literally can tell it's bat. You don't have to do that, but I'm sure it's bat. But what's happening is bats do what's called night roosting. So a bat will go out and fly around for an hour or 2 hours, get a full belly, then go sit someplace warm and out of the wind to digest food. So it's doing this at 11 o'clock at night in summer until midnight or until 2 in the morning. And then they leave again. So they're doing this in the middle of the night. That's why you don't ever see them. But if you sneak out there probably give it 2 hours after sunset and then you peek up there, I'll bet you might see them.
So the question is, isn't bat feces dangerous to handle?
Well, large accumulations of bat feces can create a risk for histoplasmosis. So if you've ever known anybody who's worked in like poultry farms, big piles of turkey and chicken droppings can get a fungus in them. And then if you're cleaning those up, you can get the fungus in your lungs. Big accumulations of bat feces can get that as well. But I've never heard any real issues with small accumulations of it. Now, I don't think it's something, so I'm not really literally encouraging you to pick up bat feces and do this. But I've never really heard much problems with bat, and I have handled an awful lot of bat poop in my time. So no, it's not really something I encourage you to do, and I generally wash my hands fairly quickly after doing it, but it's not really anything that I worry too much about.
Who's next? Anyone? Interesting note for last question. We need another question. Well, you did mention, just so everyone knows, that maybe next summer may come out and try to do a little netting for bats around Sugarloaf. And we had someone mention that just up Sugarloaf Road, there's some good areas with overhanging trees that may be a good spot.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
we have Sugarloaf, we have a couple creeks that maybe would be good spots too.
Yeah. No, I would love to do that. I would have to get permits, and this is just maybe interesting for folks, but to do work in Minnesota, I would have to get permits, and I don't have them yet. Most states are pretty easy to get permits, but South Dakota isn't for whatever reason. So I'll have to check and see what the story is with permits in Minnesota. But my wife and I, we love to come up to your neck of the woods up there, and we're actually looking at retiring up there at some point in time. And so I want to start introducing myself to bats and to people up there so that we can start getting to know folks and kind of start moving our base of operations up that way.
Great. Oh, here's another question. Helen asked, what is the status of bats in the Sudan mine? I heard there aren't any left. Do you know the Sudan mine? It's in the Iron Range of Minnesota, so.
Right, right.
Yeah.
I had forgotten the name of it. And I did see a talk, 2 years ago, where, yeah, some species are, basically the 90 to 100% fatalities that we've been talking about. Other species are doing fairly well still, at least based on the talk from a couple of years ago. So my guess is things like big brown bats are probably doing fine. But little brown bats, which were one of the common ones up there, and northern long-eared bats, which were one of the common ones up there, and tricolored bats, actually, now that I think about it, are all up there. And I think their numbers were really tanking. Now, in some places way east, New York State, we're seeing that bat populations kind of reached a bottom at, like 1% of their pre-fungus conditions. But now they do appear to be slowly coming back. So it looks like there are some individuals in populations that are immune. So eventually we think we may get some of our bat populations back, but bats are really slow reproducers. So it's going to take, it's not going to be within my lifetime that this happens.
Thank you so much. This was just a great talk. Good
Thank you very
pictures.
much.
Nice to have the research to be able to check those other resources out too.
Great.
Thanks, Russ.
Okay, you bet. Yeah, if you want that list of references, let me know, because I can send it to Molly and then she can distribute it to folks.
And we did record this, so eventually I will try to get this on to something where people could watch it or check back in and learn again about their questions and all that.
Right.
So yeah, it may take me a little bit.
Could I ask a question quick before we
Sure.
go?
Go ahead.
But I just had something you had just said made me wonder how fast or how you said how much do they reproduce? Like, or does it vary a lot across the spectrum?
It varies a bit, but not an awful lot. One of the really strong patterns you see in the mammal world is that the longer you live, the fewer babies you have at one time. Bats, surprisingly, are very long-lived. So big brown bats, the best known bat on Earth, the average lifespan is 10 to 12 years. Some individuals have been known to get up into their 30s. And so when you live that long, you tend to have very few babies. So they have 1 or 2 babies per year. And so that's slow reproduction.
Well, let's see, more questions rolling in here. Of course, we should ask this question. What can we do as individuals to help the bat population?
Yeah, that's a little bit of a tough one, because you can put out bat houses, but as a rule, the problems that are causing bat declines aren't going to be solved by bat houses. So bat houses are something you do to try and bring bats to you because you want to experience them, because you want to try and have their help controlling insects. But we don't literally think you're going to do a lot to help bat populations. So the things that you can do are learn more and educate others about them. Educate your lawmakers about them so that they can help pass laws for them. Some of the things that some people can do is, try and protect those big mature forests, because big mature forests basically are inhabited by a unique set of bats. And do the best that you can to try and keep standing dead trees standing, because those are, like as I commented earlier, those are used by a lot of species. Many landowners just think they're ugly and they immediately cut them down, but try and convince your neighbors to keep those as long as they can. So those are some of the things. But you can. I gave bat talks at schools for elementary kids, and man, the teachers just loved that. So educate yourself a little bit, get some cool props, and get out in the schools and start teaching.
Let's see, got some.
And we're
Great
busy.
presentation. You're a fantastic teacher.
Thank you.
Let's see. Thank you. Best presentation in a long time. Hey, let's see. Here's another question. Are there efforts to breed bats in lab settings and reintroduce them to areas with sparse populations?
You certainly hear that with some critters, and it is being done with some of the highly endangered species. That I know of, it's generally not done with insect-eating bats. Insect-eating bats eat so many insects, and the act of learning to eat insects is so challenging that we don't know how successful we are raising baby bats in captivity to actually have them survive.
Oh,
But some of the fruit-eating bats are much easier to train, and there they are actually, you know, they do have captive breeding populations, and they are reintroducing individuals out into the wild. So yes, in some places, and no in others is the answer to that.
yes, I've seen some in zoos, the fruit eating. They.
Yeah.
Let's see, can bats take off from the ground, or what happens if they're on the ground?
There's a handful of species that the Mexican free-tailed bats with the really long, skinny wings, they have a really hard time getting up off the ground if they fall on the ground. What they'll do is they'll try and crawl to some place and find a tree or the edge of a cave and climb back up, and so they can launch off again, but they can't jump straight off the ground. Other species with more short, round wings, they can jump right off the ground. The bat that I showed the picture of, where you could see the sunlight coming through its wings, so that's a bat that actually drops down onto the ground in the desert Southwest and runs around and catches crickets and scorpions, all sorts of cool things. They can just explode right off the ground. So we caught 4 of them that night. I wanted to get a picture of them on the forest floor, on the desert floor, to get them in their natural habitat. So I would have students put their hands over the bat. The students would take their hands out of the way, and I take the picture, and I never did get a picture. They exploded that fast that I could not get a picture of them. So some bats are very good at it, other ones not so much. And by the way, so in some of the big caves where Mexican free-tailed bats roost, there are thousands and thousands of insects per square 10 yards that are eating mostly bat poop. But if a baby bat or an adult bat falls to the ground, it's probably not going to survive, because those insects are going to jump on it before it can get to the sides and crawl up and survive. So some of them die.
Let's see, have European bats adapted to white nose syndrome?
Yes. Yeah, they do not show hardly any symptoms. They do carry the fungus. You can literally see it on them, but it doesn't create the problems for them that it does for our local bats. And you see that very commonly with these invasive species that are brought to a new area. Yeah, the native species just have no familiarity with them and have, you know, very few defenses.
So that's kind of what Helen was asking. Are there bats which survive the white nose syndrome? Do they have immunity?
Yes, it appears to be a pretty small percentage, but at least the 2 species where it's been monitored, it does look like that's happening. We're going to hope it happens in everybody, and we won't see any extinctions, but yeah, we don't really know right now.
Anybody else have a question they want to ask? These are all great questions.
Yeah.
Really good. Oh,
I have a question. I can't figure out how to operate chat. So I'll ask, as a master naturalist, I've given some presentations to elementary students in Silver Bay, and I was wondering if, Russell, I could use you as a resource.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I can, you know, if you need photographs and that kind of stuff, I can send you those things. I can send you my slideshow if you want to kind of modify that for use. If you have questions, absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
You bet.
Thank you.
I have another question about babies. Can you just talk a little bit about how they like give birth and raise their babies?
Okay, yeah, a little bit. So first of all, babies are quite big in relation to the size of females. So the babies come out at about a third the body weight of the female. So think about that. If you're a 120-pound human and you give birth to a 40-pound baby, but they give birth, you know, pretty much a standard mammal way. Most bats they have what's called a cloaca, and a cloaca is an internal chamber. So they only appear to have a single opening to the outside. So their separate reproductive opening and urinary opening and fecal openings are all emptying into that central chamber. So the baby goes into that little central chamber, then comes out. So more or less a vaginal birth. When females are getting ready to give birth, they hook their thumbs onto wherever it is they're roosting, and they hang right side up. So normally they're roosting, you know, upside down, but now they roost right side up. They curl their tail membrane, so the baby just pops out and falls right into the tail membrane. Then they grab them, and then they immediately put them on them to let them start nursing. And then basically what will happen is as soon as it's time for mom to go out and feed, she leaves the babies right where they're roosting. So very few bats ever carry their babies. They will occasionally do that, like in emergency situations. You know, a raccoon just found us, and we've got to get out of here. But other than those kinds of situations, they really don't carry babies. So wherever it is that the female's roosting, which is either out in the leaves of trees or a hollow tree or something along those lines, that's usually where the babies stay during the day. Babies grow very fast. Feeding on nothing but milk, and they're basically the same time sequence as a songbird would be. So they're born, roughly June 1, June 15, somewhere in that range. And by about 1 month of age, they're out and flying. What happens at that point, we don't really know. We don't know how much time they spend with mom, how much teaching happens. It appears that some teaching and learning is going on there, but we don't exactly know an awful lot about it. Basically, once bats are out and flying, there's essentially nothing we can do. We can't attach cameras to them. They're too small for that. So we really don't know what they do once they're out on the wing. But yeah, so basically by then, that next summer, when a baby bat is roughly a year old, some of the females give birth to their first set of babies. Some of them actually wait until they're 2 years of age. But there's a little bit of a sense for reproduction in them.
Great. Let's see. So same question. Would it be possible to vaccinate a bat against the white nose syndrome?
Yeah, there certainly is a lot of research going on. Are there vaccines against fungi? I don't know if there are. I don't think there are. So that's not really the path that folks are going down. Mostly the path that they're looking at is there is a bacterium that is naturally occurring in caves that reduces the number of fungi. And so they're thinking about trying to increase the amount of that bacterium, which at least would bring mortality down. It probably wouldn't stop it, but at least it would bring it down. And then there's a second avenue of research, and I'll be darned if I'm blanking on it right now. But there's research going into a couple of possible solutions. One of the real issues you have is that mostly these are cave roosting bats. There are so many unique species that live in caves that we can't take any steps that would cause extinctions or major problems for other species in those caves. So we can't just go in and fumigate the entire cave, because that would probably wipe out a number of species of fungi that are only found in that cave. So that's one of the tricks that's going on here, is caves are really sensitive environments. So that's kind of slowed down some of the potential cures that folks have been looking at.
Interesting. Anyone else? More just wonderful questions. Okay. Well, last chance here. Anyone? This has been really great. Very interesting. Learned a lot.
Well, thank you. And yeah, and anybody, so Molly has my email contact. So if you need to contact me, just get a hold of her and she'll shuttle the information to me.
Yeah, great. And I can see from all the comments, everybody loved it. Thank you so much, everyone says. This is great. Thanks, everyone. And we hope to have more programs in the future throughout the winter, zooming away. So great. And I hope you all have a happy Halloween, and see you next time. So thanks, everybody. And thanks, Russ.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Getting a lot of thank yous right now. So
Good.
That's good to see.
Yeah, it looked like we got to like 32 or no, even 35, I think.
Yes, 35. That
very
was
nice. So this is
wonderful.
the first time you've tried the evening events?
Yeah, in fact, someone says we like the Tuesday format versus Saturday. So
Cool.
that's good to know. And I think it is for people more convenient on a weekday evening than a Saturday morning if we're not on site.
All right. Well, I'm going to head home because I still have a little bit of grading to do tonight.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Let's see if we can do some sort of a netting program either this summer or next. I'll talk to my wife and see when she wants to go. All we need is a little bit of an excuse to head back up there.
Come on up. All right. Great.
All right. Have a good night.
Thanks, Russ. Yeah. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everybody.